We looked at part of the story of the prophet Elijah in our most recent sermon upload that we did. Now we want to try to finish out that story of Elijah. And I want to begin with a verse in 1 Kings 19 that raises some questions. In 1 Kings 19 and verse 4, he himself, that's talking about Elijah, he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree and requested for himself that he might die, and said, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." There's something very strange about this scene. Elijah is obviously at a very low point, so low that he wants to die. But we would think, if we have been reading the text up to here, that this should be a high point for him. Remember in our last lesson what had happened previously in our study of Elijah. Ahab and Jezebel had introduced the worship of the false god Baal, the false god supposedly of rain and storms and fertility. And Elijah, rather than offering a doctrinal argument about this, simply challenged the power of Baal. He called for a drought, and this drought lasted for 3.5 years. That Baal, being a false god, no real power there, nothing behind that idol, was unable to bring rain to that area. And this 3.5 years culminated in a challenge on Mount Carmel, him against the prophets of Baal. And in that challenge, Jehovah, God, was vindicated. Remember, they both made altars. They both put wood and meat on their altar. Neither one of them offered fire or put fire on that altar. The prophets of Baal, for most of the day, prayed and shouted for their God to send fire, and he did not. Nothing happened. And then Elijah prayed, and God sent fire upon the altar. And the prophets of Baal were defeated, and they were actually destroyed. This was a great victory. This vindicated Jehovah God, and it vindicated Elijah as his prophet. Immediately after the victory, the defeated prophets of Baal were all destroyed, according to 1 Kings 18 and verse 40. And Elijah prophesied that there would be an abundance of rain in verse 41. In fact, in verse 44, he sent a message by his servant to Ahab that told him basically to get back to Jezreel quickly, so that he wouldn't be hindered by the rain because there was a storm coming. It hadn't rained for 3.5 years. But this was a clear reminder from Elijah to Ahab that Baal did not control the weather. Jehovah God did. There was a great storm that ensued, and Elijah was vindicated again as a true prophet. After Ahab arrived at home, he told Jezebel about all that had happened. This is in chapter 19 and verse 1. And in verse 2 of chapter 19, Jezebel sent a message to Elijah, "You're going to be as dead as those prophets of Baal." In 24 hours, she said, by tomorrow about this time. There's nothing new to this, to Elijah's situation. He had been a fugitive for 3.5 years already since he announced that there would be a drought, and God had been protecting him for all of this time. Elijah had not been afraid when at the end of the 3.5 years, God sent him to face Ahab and to challenge the false prophets or the prophets of the false god Baal. Elijah had not backed down when Ahab falsely accused him of being the one who was troubling Israel. He said, "I'm not the one troubling Israel. You are the troubler of Israel." Elijah was not in any sense a coward. So why was it that when Jezebel made this threat, in the next 24 hours you're going to die, why did he flee? Why was he so discouraged at this point that he was requesting for himself that he wanted to die? I challenge that. I say that in some ways, at least, Elijah did not want to die, or he did not want to die at her hand. If he had wanted to die, simply to die, he could have stayed where he was and let Jezebel kill him. Instead, he's fleeing for his life and requesting that his life be taken away from him. It's a strange kind of a situation. So we have to ask the question, what was truly going on? And while we may not understand all the depths of it, we only have what is revealed to us. The words that Elijah spoke here give us some insight into what he was feeling, what he was going through. Again, in 1 Kings 19 and verse 4, it says, he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die and said, it is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. In chapter 19, verses 9 and 10, we see a similar thing said by him. It says in verse 9 that he came thither unto a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said unto him, what doest thou here, Elijah? And in verse 10, he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. It is enough, he said. It seems like this last threat was the final straw, and that poor camel's back just broke. Couldn't take any more. When it seemed like he had won everything, nothing had changed from an earthly point of view. He was still a fugitive. He was still in danger. This great victory didn't seem to mean anything. And he said, it's enough. But from this event in the life of this prophet, this discouragement that he went through, we learned some wonderful lessons. We want to look at those lessons today about discouragement and how to handle it. Number one, when we're discouraged, we need to take care of our physical bodies. Oftentimes when people are depressed and discouraged, they stop taking care of themselves as they ought to. In 1 Kings 19, verses 5 through 8, after Elijah had sat down under the juniper tree and requested for himself that he might die, it says in verse 5, as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, an angel touched him and said unto him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was a cake baken on the coals and a cruse of water at his head. And he did eat and drink and laid him down again. In verse 7, it says, and the angel of the Lord came again the second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. In verse 8, and he arose and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mount of God. We need to remember that our moods are often linked to our physical well-being. Now, our physical problems are not an excuse for being short, for snapping at each other, for, hormones are not an excuse for unfaithfulness. Sin is the result of desire, not disease. So I don't want to be quoted as if I'm saying that our physical problems give us an excuse to do something that's wrong. But in this time of great stress for Elijah, God made sure to meet his physical needs. He allowed him to sleep, and he fed him. He allowed him to sleep again, and he fed him again. In Mark 6 and verse 31, it says that Jesus took his disciples apart from the crowds, from the multitudes, because they had no leisure, not so much as even to eat. Sometimes leisure time is important time. And when we're discouraged, it's important that we remember to take care of our physical bodies. But this was the most minor of the lessons that we want to learn from that. Number two, we want to learn that it's not a sin to be discouraged. It may be a sign that our faith needs strengthening. In Luke 22, verses 31 and 32, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired thee that he may sift thee as wheat, but I have prayed for thee that thy faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. 4 times in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus chides his disciples with the words, O ye of little faith, or in chapter 14 to Simon directly, O thou of little faith. There is here in this passage in 1 Kings 19 a tenderness, a gentleness. God did not say to Elijah, you coward, after all that I've done for you, all that I've provided for you, all the ways I've taken care of you and protected you, you have the nerve to sit here and complain? We would have thought God would have been justified in saying those things to Elijah, but that's not what he did. That's not what he said. You see, it's not a sin to be discouraged. It's a natural thing at times. As long as we don't allow that discouragement to overcome us. Lesson number 3, extremely important. When we think we're alone, we're not. This is the lesson of the still small voice. It's really the heart of this lesson today. Elijah went on in his journey from there under the juniper tree to the Mount of God. Now, this was a very, very special place. This is Mount Horeb, or it's part of the Sinai range of mountains. And it's here that God appeared to Moses in the burning bush. It's here that he delivered the law to the Israelites. In this special place, this is where Elijah is. And there he lodged in a cave, the text says. God spoke to him. 1 Kings 19:9. What doest thou here, Elijah? And his response in verse 10 is, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Notice again that while he was under the juniper tree, he had requested to die. Now he's complaining that they were trying to kill him. Does he want to die or not want to die? Especially notice how alone he feels at this time. I, even I only, am left. He actually ends up saying that twice. At the end of this conversation, God reminds him that as far as people here on the earth, he was not alone. He was wrong. God corrects him in his evaluation that I, even I only, am left. In chapter 19 and verse 18, he says, Yet I have left to me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. He is not alone. But before that, when Elijah makes this claim that I, even I only, am left, God corrects him in a more subtle way. Beginning in verse 11, God said, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in a mantle and went out and stood in the entering in of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. There was a wind that passed by that was strong enough to break rocks, but God was not in the wind. There was an earthquake that happened, but God was not in that earthquake. There was a fire, one of the most destructive forces on the face of the earth, but God was not in that fire. And then there was a still, small voice. And when he heard that voice, Elijah covered his face and went out and made his complaint again. So what is the significance of the still, small voice? I don't want to read into this something that's not there, and I don't claim to understand all of the significance of this passage. I'm sure that as I study it more, I will see more insights into it in future years. But there seem to be some very obvious connections here with this concept of the still small voice. You know, it was a still small voice that announced the drought. Standing against the rulers, standing against the false prophets, Elijah spoke, and God was with that still small voice, and this drought happened for 3.5 years. God was in the still small voice on Mount Carmel. The prophets of Baal were many, and they were loud, 450 of them shouting and cutting themselves and trying to get the attention of Baal and appealing to him to send fire on their offering. When they got done, Elijah prayed a simple prayer. And fire came in response to Elijah's prayer because God was with the still small voice. When the still small voice prophesied that it would rain again right after that contest, it did rain again. Huge, huge rainstorm, an abundance of rain, because God was with the still, small voice. Elijah says twice, I, even I only am left. And he was wrong. That's what it looked like from his point of view. But God is reminding him he was never alone. Through this whole process, he was never alone. When he was hiding by the brook, being fed by ravens, he was not alone. When he was fleeing to Zarephath, he was not alone. When he stood against the 450 prophets of Baal, he said, I'm one and you're many. When he stood against them on Mount Carmel, he was not alone. Now that Jezebel is threatening his life, he's still not alone. As David wrote years before, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. He's not walking alone. Elijah did not go through any of this alone. He felt alone, but he was not. The unknown writer of Hebrews wrote many centuries later by inspiration, reminding us of God's promise and his presence. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. So that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what men shall do to me. So what was God's antidote to Elijah's discouragement? He took care of his physical needs. He did not sharply rebuke or chide him. There may be some rebuke in the question, what doest thou here? But not the kind of rebuke that we might have expected. He reminded him that he was never alone. And then, finally, he put him back to work. In 1 Kings 19, beginning in verse 15, the Lord said unto him, go return on the way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And verse 16, Jehu, the son of Nimshi, shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel, and Elijah, the son of Shaphat, of Abel-Maholah, shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room, in thy stead. Discouragement is not an excuse for doing nothing. Being discouraged about soul winning doesn't give us a pass so that we don't have to try. Being discouraged about something going on in our local congregation does not make it okay to stop attending. Elijah didn't belong in this cave. There was work to be done. There is no excuse for hiding in a cave when God has work for us to do. In fact, when we're discouraged, if we have a tendency to pull back from our prayers, to pull back from our Bible studies, to pull back from other Christians, that doesn't help the discouragement. It does exactly the opposite. When we start shirking our duty, we feel guilty about that and we feel more discouraged. We know that we are not right with God. It's important that we understand that one of the great antidotes to discouragement is to do the work that God wants us to do, to be involved. Elijah was a great man. He was a man of courage. He was a man of conviction. He was a man of strength. He actually rode to heaven on a whirlwind, according to 2 Kings 2 and verse 11, rather than dying. At that time, Elisha was there, the one that he had anointed to take his place as prophet. Elisha was there and he saw that, and Elisha called him the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. Elijah was a great man. Elijah, centuries later, stood on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and Jesus. He was truly a great man, but he faced this time of discouragement. So when you're discouraged, remember this great man. He was discouraged also. Take care of your physical needs. Remember that it is not necessarily a sin to be discouraged as long as we don't allow that to cause us to sin or to keep us from doing right. Remember that you are not alone. You are never alone. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not alone in the fire. Daniel was not alone in the lion's den. We are never alone when God is on our side. And keep working. Don't shirk. Keep doing the things that God bids us to do. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. And as Jesus said, I must be about my Father's business. Thank you so much for tuning in.